Somewhere in a hospital room in Ohio, a 91-year-old man named Walter looked at his son and said something his son has never been able to shake. He said, "I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid I hadn't really lived while I still had the chance." He wasn't talking about some grand, unlived adventure. No unclimbed mountain, no unwritten novel. He was talking about small mornings he rushed through, conversations he cut short because he was busy, a whole decade he spent waiting to feel ready. And here's the strange part. When you ask people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s what they tell their 40-year-old selves, you get 8 answers that show up again and again. Most of them are not what you'd expect. And there's one, near the very end of this list, that almost nobody says out loud, because saying it means admitting what they missed. Stay with me until then. You'll know it when you hear it. So today we're going to walk through 8 pieces of advice that elders, real elders, the ones who've actually lived long enough to look back with clear eyes, wish someone had handed them at 40. Not as a lecture, not as a list you skim and forget, but as a conversation, the kind you'd have with someone who has nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide. Some of this will comfort you. Some of it might sting a little in the way truth sometimes does. But by the end, you're going to understand something most people don't figure out until it's almost too late, and you still have time to use it. Let's start with the one that surprises people the most. Reason number 1 is the one almost every elder brings up first, often before you've even finished asking the question. Think about the thing you've been telling yourself you'll get to once things settle down. The trip, the phone call, the hobby you used to love. Be honest for a second. How long has someday actually been sitting on your calendar? Here's what elders understand now that most 40-year-olds don't yet. There is no finish line where life finally clears space for you. The mortgage gets paid off and something else quietly takes its place. The kids grow up and move out, and new worries move in to fill the empty rooms. Waiting for the right time isn't patience. It's a form of avoidance that's learned to dress itself up as responsibility, so it never gets questioned. Psychologists have a name for part of this: temporal discounting, the tendency to treat future time as though it's unlimited while present time feels tight and overloaded. Your brain isn't wired to protect you from long-term regret. It's wired to protect you from immediate discomfort, because discomfort feels urgent right now and regret doesn't. Regret only shows up decades later, quietly, when you're the one doing the math on what you actually spent your years on. What elders wish they'd understood at 40 is that someday isn't a neutral holding pattern. It's a decision made over and over to keep the meaningful thing just out of reach. And the strange, almost unbearable part is that most of what gets postponed isn't even large. It's rarely the big swing that never happened. It's the weekend visit, the unhurried conversation, the 10 minutes of full attention given to someone who, it turns out, wasn't going to be around forever. Those are the things that generate the deepest regret later, not the failures but the small, low-cost gestures that kept getting bumped to next week, and the week after that, until there were no more weeks left to bump them to. There's a particular version of this elders describe again and again, the friend they meant to visit next summer. For 12 summers in a row, until there wasn't a next summer left to postpone into. It's rarely one dramatic decision. It's 1,000 small deferrals, each one reasonable enough on its own, that quietly add up to an entire relationship or an entire dream, running out of time while nobody was watching the clock. And here's the part that catches most people off guard. The deferral almost never feels like a choice in the moment. It feels like responsibility. It feels like being sensible, waiting for a better window that logic insists is coming. But elders will tell you, plainly, that the better window rarely arrives on its own. It has to be made, deliberately, out of a today that never feels quite ready enough. The people who eventually did the thing they'd been postponing almost never described feeling more ready when they finally did it. They just described deciding that ready was never going to be a feeling. It was going to have to be a choice. If right now you can picture the exact thing someday has been quietly protecting you from, that's not an accident. That's some part of you that already knows the truth, trying to get a word in before it's too late to matter. That's not laziness. That's fear, wearing a very convincing disguise. And once you can see that disguise clearly, you start to notice a second one, quieter, and in some ways more dangerous, because this one doesn't live in your calendar. It lives in your body. So if there's one thing to carry out of this first reason, let it be this: someday is not a plan. It's a story you tell yourself to avoid an uncomfortable truth today. And the sooner you stop believing that story, the sooner you get your life back. Which brings us to the second thing almost every elder wishes they'd taken seriously, decades before they finally had no choice. Reason number 2 has nothing to do with time. It has to do with a whisper that most people spend years training themselves to ignore. The tired that doesn't go away with sleep. The ache you explain away because you're just busy. The small warning your own body has been sending quietly for longer than you'd like to admit. Elders who've lived long enough to look back clearly will tell you the same thing, almost word for word. The body speaks in whispers long before it ever has to shout. And most people, in the middle of their lives, are trained by work, by responsibility, by sheer momentum, to override that whisper rather than listen to it. Pushing through becomes a kind of identity. Being the one who doesn't complain, who doesn't slow down, who handles it, becomes something to be proud of, right up until the moment it isn't. This isn't about any specific diagnosis or a scare tactic. It's about a pattern of relating to your own body as an obstacle to manage rather than a partner to listen to. When you treat exhaustion as something to push past instead of something to understand, you're not being strong. You're postponing a conversation your body is going to insist on having eventually, on its own terms, often at a much higher cost than it would have asked for earlier. What elders wish someone had told them at 40 is that self-neglect rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. It looks like skipping the checkup because things feel fine. It looks like normalizing a low hum of fatigue as just what adulthood feels like. It looks like treating rest as something you have to earn rather than something you simply need. And by the time the whisper becomes impossible to ignore, years of small signals have usually already been quietly overruled. Ask almost any elder which years of their life they wish they could live over more gently, and a surprising number will mention something as ordinary as sleep, or a daily walk, or 10 unhurried minutes spent doing absolutely nothing productive. Not because those things are glamorous, because they were the very first things sacrificed whenever life got demanding, and the very last things anyone thought to defend. There's a quiet irony elders notice looking back. The years they were proudest of professionally were often the same years their bodies were sending the loudest warnings, and they wore the exhaustion itself like a badge of honor, mistaking depletion for dedication. It rarely occurred to them at the time that a body maintained with care could have carried them through those same years with far less cost on the other side. Rest, in hindsight, wasn't the thing standing between them and their goals. It was the thing that would have let them reach those goals and still have something left over: energy, patience, presence, for the parts of life happening at exactly the same time, quietly in the background, never demanding attention the way deadlines do. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with realizing later in life how much of your body's early language you simply didn't have the vocabulary or the willingness to hear. Not because you didn't care, because nobody ever taught you that listening to your body wasn't weakness. It was maintenance. It was respect for the only place you actually get to live. That's not overreacting. That's finally paying attention. And once you start listening to your body again, something else tends to surface right alongside it. A longer list of people you've also been quietly neglecting in a much less obvious way. So the second thing elders wish they'd known earlier is simple, even if it isn't easy. Your body was never the enemy keeping you from your life. It was the messenger trying to help you protect it, which leads naturally into a kind of neglect that's even easier to overlook, because it doesn't happen inside you. It happens in the space between you and the people you love. Reason number 3 starts with something small. A name sitting in your phone that you haven't tapped in years. Not because anything went wrong, just because life got in the way, and then it kept getting in the way until the silence itself became the relationship. Elders talk about this one with a particular kind of ache, because unlike health, it rarely announces itself as a crisis. It just fades. Friendships that once felt permanent quietly dissolve under the weight of nothing more dramatic than both people waiting for the other to reach out first. And plain, ordinary pride is often the only thing standing in the way. Here's the psychological trap hiding inside this one. Waiting to be contacted feels safer than reaching out, because reaching out risks rejection, or worse, indifference. So you wait. And the other person, feeling the exact same fear, waits too. Weeks become months. Months become years. And eventually the friendship isn't ended by any single decision. It simply expires from neglect, the way anything living does when nobody waters it. What elders wish they'd understood at 40 is that maintaining relationships isn't something that happens automatically just because history exists between two people. Shared history creates the foundation, but it doesn't maintain the structure. Attention does. A phone call. A message that says nothing more than, "I was thinking about you." These cost almost nothing to send and almost everything to have never sent, once the person on the other end is no longer reachable at all. There's also a quieter version of this mistake, one that happens even inside relationships that never went silent, marriages, family, old friendships that technically continued but grew thin. Presence isn't the same as proximity. You can sit across the table from someone for 30 years and still, somehow, never really reach them, because reaching someone takes more than being in the room. It takes choosing them actively again and again, even on the ordinary days when there's no occasion demanding it. There's a specific kind of regret elders describe around this one that's different from the others, a regret with no clear moment attached to it. Nobody can point to the exact day a friendship ended, because it didn't end on any particular day. It just got thinner, conversation by skipped conversation, until one day someone mentions the old friend's name and you realize, with a small jolt, that you genuinely don't know if they're even still alive. That specific kind of not knowing is one of the quieter griefs elders carry, and almost all of them will tell you the same thing about it. It was preventable, right up until, quite suddenly, it wasn't. The fix, they'll also tell you, was never complicated. It rarely required a grand gesture or a difficult conversation. It usually just required being the one who reaches out first, even when it felt unnecessary, even when there was no clear reason for the silence in the first place. Because waiting for a reason to reconnect is itself often the very habit that let the silence take hold. That's not distance happening to you. That's distance you're quietly choosing, one postponed phone call at a time. And if that stings a little, hold on to that feeling, because the next thing on this list explains exactly why so many people let that distance grow in the first place, and it has almost nothing to do with being too busy. So if there's a name sitting in your phone right now, that's not a coincidence either. That's the part of you that already knows what elders take a lifetime to learn, that the people you love aren't guaranteed to still be reachable when you finally feel ready to reach them. 3 down, 5 still to go. And the next one is where things start to get a little more uncomfortable in the most useful way possible. Reason number 4 is the one that tends to make a room go quiet, because on the surface it sounds almost selfish until you understand what it's actually protecting. For most of adulthood, a huge amount of energy gets spent managing what other people think, saying yes when you mean no, softening opinions until they're unrecognizable, staying in the room, the job, the version of yourself that keeps everyone comfortable, even when it's slowly costing you something real. And the reward for all that management is usually just more of the same expectation, because people learn very quickly what they can ask of you. Elders who've had the years to look back on this pattern describe something almost universal. Somewhere in their 60s or 70s, a switch quietly flips. The opinions of people who were never going to remember the disagreement in a week stop carrying the weight they used to. Not because those elders stopped caring about others, the ones who aged well usually care more, not less, but because they finally learned to separate genuine care from performance. Genuine care means showing up honestly for the people who matter. Performance means managing an audience of people who mostly weren't paying that much attention in the first place. What elders wish they'd known at 40 is that most of the disapproval they spent years avoiding was imagined, exaggerated, or simply temporary. A passing reaction in someone else's day that they carried around, unnecessarily, for months or years. Meanwhile, the actual cost of that avoidance was real and ongoing. Relationships built on performance instead of honesty, decisions made to keep the peace instead of to live truthfully, and a growing distance from their own preferences, until they weren't entirely sure anymore what they wanted versus what they'd simply agreed to often enough that it started to feel like wanting. Elders often describe a specific turning point tied to this, not a single dramatic event, but an accumulation of small ones, each time they said yes to something that quietly cost them a piece of themselves. A career path chosen to satisfy a parent's expectations rather than their own curiosity. A silence kept at a family gathering, to avoid a disagreement that would have been over in an hour but felt unbearable to risk. Looked at individually, none of these moments seem significant enough to regret. Looked at together across 30 or 40 years, They can add up to a life quietly steered by other people's comfort rather than your own convictions. What elders describe feeling, once they finally stopped managing everyone else's reactions, wasn't recklessness. It was relief, the specific relief of realizing that most of the disapproval they'd spent decades avoiding would have lasted, at most, a few uncomfortable minutes, and cost them nothing close to what avoiding it had actually cost. This isn't a call to stop caring what anyone thinks. It's a call to notice how much of your life has quietly been rented out to people who were never going to pay you back for it. That's not selfish. That's finally living as yourself, instead of as everyone else's version of you. If some part of you just recognized itself in that, you're not alone, and stay with me because the next reason is closely related, except this time it's not about approval. It's about what you've been chasing instead. So the fourth thing elders wish they'd learned sooner is this. Approval is a currency that expires the moment you stop performing for it. And the people worth keeping in your life were never asking you to perform in the first place. Reason number 5 asks a question most people never say out loud, even to themselves. What is money actually for? For a lot of people in the middle of their working lives, money quietly becomes a scoreboard, a way of measuring progress against neighbors, siblings, old classmates, even past versions of themselves. More becomes the goal without much thought given to more of what or more for whom. And chasing that scoreboard often means trading away the very things money was supposed to buy in the first place. Time, presence, rest, unstructured afternoons with people you love. Elders describe this reversal with real clarity, usually because they've watched it happen twice, once in their own lives and once in the lives of people they love who are still caught in it. The version of wealth that actually holds up over a lifetime isn't the biggest number in an account. It's the number of unhurried mornings you got to have. The vacations that weren't secretly stressful. The ability to say, I don't need to work today, and mean it even occasionally, long before retirement made it official. What elders wish they'd known at 40 is that the anxiety of not enough rarely resolves itself by earning more. It just recalibrates to the new number because the anxiety was never really about the number, it was about a feeling of security that money alone can't fully provide. Some of the wealthiest people, by any account, still describe themselves as anxious about money right up until the end, because the goalpost kept moving with the income. Meanwhile, some of the people who felt richest in their final decades were the ones who'd made peace years earlier with having enough, not everything, just enough, and had redirected the difference toward time instead of things. There's a particular story elders tell in one form or another almost every time this subject comes up. The story of a colleague or sometimes themselves who kept saying just one more year before finally slowing down, taking that trip, spending real time with grandchildren, only to have that one more year quietly become 5, then 10, because there was always a reasonable sounding justification for staying on the treadmill a little longer. The treadmill, elders point out, never announces when it's time to step off. It just keeps offering the next perfectly logical reason to keep running. What ends up separating the people who step off in time from the people who don't usually isn't the size of their savings account. It's whether they ever stop to ask what specifically all that earning was actually in service of, and whether the honest answer still matched the life they were actually living, or the one they'd quietly stopped living years before without quite noticing the switch. This isn't advice to stop planning or stop working. It's a reminder that money was always meant to be a tool for building a life, not a replacement for having one. That's not irresponsible. That's finally spending your resources on what they were meant for. If you're still with me, take a breath, because what's coming next isn't about time or money or approval at all. It's about something a lot of people spend their whole lives trying not to feel. So the fifth thing elders wish they'd understood is this. Being rich and being free are not the same thing, and chasing the first one too hard often costs you the second. Real wealth, it turns out, was never about the number. It was about what the number was quietly buying you, or quietly taking away. If you're still here, this next part matters even more than everything before it, because it's the piece most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid feeling, let alone talking about. So let's slow down for a moment and sit with it honestly. Reason number 6 begins in a moment nobody wants to think about ahead of time. The day something or someone is simply gone. Parent, a marriage, a version of your own health you didn't realize you were taking for granted until it changed. Elders talk about grief differently than almost anyone else because by the time you've lived 70, 80, 90 years, you've usually lost more than most people are willing to imagine. and you've learned something the rest of the world tends to get wrong. Grief isn't a problem to be solved or a phase to be efficiently completed. It's not something you get over on any predictable schedule, no matter how much the people around you might quietly wish you would. Somewhere in midlife, a lot of people absorb the idea that grief should be private, brief, and manageable, that being strong means moving through loss quickly and quietly, so as not to burden anyone else with it. So they compress it. They go back to work 3 days after the funeral. They tell themselves they're fine because saying otherwise feels like failing at something they're supposed to already know how to do. What elders wish they'd known at 40 is that grief postponed doesn't disappear. It relocates. It shows up later as unexplained irritability, or a strange flatness that settles over things that used to matter, or a grief for something else entirely that seems to arrive out of proportion to the actual event, because it's really carrying the weight of everything that never got properly felt the first time. Grief that's allowed to move through you, fully and without a deadline, tends to soften with time. Grief that's shoved down tends to calcify, and calcified grief has a way of quietly shaping decades of a life without ever announcing itself as the reason. Elders who've buried parents, spouses, sometimes even children, often describe a specific mistake they made the first time grief entered their life, treating it like an emergency to be managed rather than a season to be lived through. They kept busy on purpose. They filled every hour so there'd be no room for the feeling to surface. And it worked for a while the way holding your breath works for a while. But grief, unlike almost anything else in life, doesn't respond well to being managed. It responds to being witnessed by yourself honestly, and ideally by someone else who won't rush you toward being fine again before you actually are. The elders who eventually made peace with their losses almost universally describe the same turning point. The moment they stopped trying to grieve efficiently, and simply let themselves grieve for as long as grieving actually took. This is, in many ways, the hardest lesson on this list, because it asks you to do the one thing an achievement-driven life trains you not to do. Stop, feel the full weight of the loss, and trust that you won't be destroyed by it. That's not weakness. That's the price, and the proof of having loved something enough for it to hurt. If any part of this landed a little too close, that's alright, you're allowed to sit with it, and I'll be right here for what's next, which is about carrying grief's opposite. The parts of your story you're still ashamed of. So the sixth thing elders wish they'd learned earlier is this. Grief isn't the opposite of moving forward. Unfelt grief is what actually keeps people stuck. And the fastest way through it has always been directly through the middle, not around the edges. If you've made it this far, you're not just listening. You're taking inventory. Good, because what comes next is the part most people need to hear more than any other. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over people in their final years. Not sadness, exactly, but a clarity that only seems to arrive once there's less time left to distract yourself from it. Elders describe looking back and realizing that almost none of their deepest regrets were about the risks they took. The regrets clustered, overwhelmingly, around the ones they didn't. The trip not taken, the words not said, the years spent waiting for permission that was never going to come from anyone but themselves. The poet Mary Oliver once asked a question that elders, more than almost anyone, have earned the right to answer honestly. What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Most people don't sit with that question until there's very little life left to plan with. But you're not most people, not right now, not while you're still listening to this. You still get to answer it while the answer can still change something. Reason number 7 is one elders often deliver with real gentleness, because it's aimed at a wound almost everyone is carrying quietly. The mistake, the failure, the chapter of your life you'd rather nobody ever asked about. Somewhere in midlife, most people are carrying at least one version of themselves they've never fully forgiven. A decision that hurt someone, a period they're not proud of, a version of who they were that doesn't match who they've become. And instead of letting that chapter close, a lot of people quietly let it define the whole book. They treat their worst moment as more true than everything that came before or after it. Elders who've reached the end of long, complicated lives tend to see this pattern with unusual clarity, because they've had the time to watch their own story keep unfolding long past the chapter they once thought would ruin everything. What felt at 40 like a permanent verdict on their character usually turned out by 70 or 80 to be one difficult chapter in a much longer story. One that kept adding new chapters of growth, repair, and change long after the mistake itself stopped mattering to anyone but them. What elders wish they'd known at 40 is that shame has a way of freezing a person's self-image at their lowest moment, as though growth stopped being possible the instant the mistake happened. But growth doesn't work that way. The version of you capable of real change was never erased by the mistake. It was standing right next to it the entire time, waiting for you to stop punishing yourself long enough to notice it was still there. There's a particular kind of self-punishment elders describe recognizing, often decades too late, the habit of bringing up an old mistake to themselves privately again and again, as though repeating it enough times might somehow finish the job of atoning for it. It never does. Shame repeated is not the same as shame resolved. It's simply shame kept alive, fed regularly, long after the actual debt has been paid many times over. What elders eventually learn, often only after watching someone they love struggle through the exact same pattern, is that real accountability has a natural endpoint. You acknowledge what happened, you make what amends are actually possible, and then you're allowed, genuinely allowed, to stop. Continuing to punish yourself past that point isn't humility. It's a kind of self-protection dressed up as conscience, a way of never having to risk being disappointed in yourself again by simply never letting yourself fully move past the disappointment you already have. This doesn't mean the mistake didn't matter, or that it shouldn't have had consequences. It means the mistake was never the entire story, no matter how loudly shame insisted that it was. That's not you making excuses. That's you finally telling the truth about the rest of the story. And once you stop letting your worst chapter narrate the whole book, something interesting happens. You start to notice what the very best chapters actually had in common. Which brings us to the last thing on this list, the one most elders almost never say out loud. So the seventh thing elders wish they'd understood sooner is this: you are not your worst decision. You are the whole book still being written, and the ending hasn't happened yet. Reason number 8 is the one that closes this list, and it's also the one elders almost never say first, because saying it means admitting out loud what they missed while they were busy being impressive. For most of adulthood, achievement feels like the obvious point of everything. Build the career. Earn the promotion. Prove that the effort was worth it. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to do meaningful work or provide well for the people you love. Elders don't regret ambition itself. What they regret, almost universally, is how often achievement quietly got chosen over presence, in moments that felt small at the time and turned out to matter enormously in hindsight. The recital missed because of a deadline that, 5 years later, nobody could even remember the details of. The dinner cut short for one more email. The years spent physically present but mentally somewhere else entirely. Already at tomorrow's meeting, already solving tomorrow's problem, while today's actual life quietly happened without full attendance. None of these moments feel dramatic while they're happening. That's exactly what makes this one so easy to miss, and so hard to undo once the pattern has repeated for 20 or 30 years. What elders wish they'd known at 40 is that nobody, at the very end, wishes they'd been more impressive to more people. They wish they'd been more present with the people who were actually in the room. Achievement fades in memory faster than almost anyone expects. Plenty of elders can't even recall the specific project that consumed an entire year of their life. But they remember, with startling clarity, the ordinary Tuesday evening someone truly showed up for them. Presence is the one form of wealth that never depreciates, because it isn't stored anywhere except inside the people who received it. There's a small, almost embarrassing detail elders mention when they talk about this one: how little the people around them actually needed. Not more vacations, not more gifts, just their attention, undivided, for stretches of time that in hindsight seem almost absurdly short. 20 minutes without a phone in the room. One dinner where nobody was thinking about tomorrow. A single afternoon where being there was the entire plan, with nothing else on the agenda competing for space. What makes this reason land so hard for so many elders is realizing how cheap presence actually was to give, and how expensive its absence turned out to be, not in any single moment, but in the slow accumulation of 1,000 almost moments that never quite became real connection, because something else always seemed to matter more at the time. This is the piece elders rarely say first, because unlike the others, it isn't really advice. It's a confession. That's not failure. That's simply what being human and being busy tends to cost, if you let it without noticing. And that confession is exactly the thread this whole video has been quietly following since the very first sentence. The one about a man named Walter, in a hospital room, telling his son the truth he'd waited far too long to say. So the eighth and final thing elders wish they'd known at 40 is the simplest, and somehow the hardest, presence, given fully and often, will always outlast achievement in the memory of the people who loved you. And it's never too late to start giving more of it, starting today.